continuing now with the agenda of the day. I wanted to welcome you to the first online Sprint 2 training workshop that will run over a series of 3 workshops from the 13th today, the 20th, as well as the 26th of April, 2023. We will be discussing modules based on integrated area-based violence prevention interventions. So the themes that we will cover over the couple of 3 days. Today we'll be focusing on violence prevention through urban upgrading methodologies, as well as gender inclusion and ABVP, which is today the 13th. And on the 20th, we'll be looking at violence prevention through urban upgrading methodologies again. And on the 26th, we'll be looking at the role of local government. I just wanted to flag out that we have a representation of multiple national government, local government, as well as provincial government participants. And we have quite a lot of other organizations as well that are joining us today. And we wanted to thank you again for the opportunity for coming here and joining us today and taking the time off to do so. Now I will be introducing Marvelous Maluleka from Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. He will be welcoming the participants for a brief 2 minutes. Marvelous, over to you. Marvelous Maluleka, could you please welcome the participants for 2 minutes from Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. The platform is yours. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
All right. So I was saying, I believe that at the end of this session, colleagues in the platform will be empowered on how to tackle the issues of urban safety through integrated area-based violence prevention intervention. We have a responsibility as officials, wherever we are stationed, be it in national government, the local government, we have a responsibility of ensuring that where we are stationed, the issue of urban safety is addressed. So without wasting any time, that's what I wanted to say to you colleagues, that you are welcome today, and I believe that you will be empowered. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marvelous. We now give the platform to Monica Ginsler from the Department of Human Settlements to also have a 2-minute welcoming and introduction to the participants today. Over to you, Monica.
Thank you so much, and good morning, colleagues. We joined a little bit late because we were on the wrong link, so apologies for that, but I think we can catch up the time lost. My name is Monica Ginsler. As indicated, I work in international relations for the Department of Human Settlements, and I want to underline for you that the work that is being done here on area-based violence prevention interventions is a crucial development intervention. So it really has an impact that is much greater than merely engendering safety, but really promotes an improved quality of life. So it is a human rights issue, it is a development issue, and it is a safety issue. So just to say that from our perspective, you are key in South Africa achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in Agenda 2030, the National Development Plan, and the New Urban Agenda. And so just to make it clear to you that your interventions are bigger than the communities in which you work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Monica. I would like to introduce Thomas Hellman, who will be discussing Sprint and introducing what Sprint is to us for 6 minutes. Thomas, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. I will try to stick to the 6 minutes. And good morning, colleagues. And first of all, to really appreciate your time here today to participate in the first capacity building session on Sprint 2. I hope that you can see my screen. Can you see it? Can you just indicate that to me?
Yes, we can see from the slide, Thomas.
Okay, great. Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, colleagues, again, as I indicated earlier today, my name is Thomas Hellman, and I am part of the Inclusive Violence and Crime Prevention program from GIZ. And really the name of and on behalf of the whole VCP team, it is really lovely to see you, and thanks for joining us here today. I wanted to give a few, just in a few minutes, to indicate a little bit about what Sprint was all about and how we conceptualized it together with our implementing partners. So Sprint really started actually just around COVID time as one of the COVID-19 emergency measures that was supported by our German government to contribute as an additional funding to the VCP program to enhance and to implement to enhance the implementation of area-based violence and crime prevention approaches, to develop tools and to grow a community of practice. It was firstly conceptualized as a 9-month project in 2020. And now we're in 2023, and we have been able to really embed Sprint also within our VCP support system to grow this community of practice and to continue working and setting really specific focus on area-based violence and crime prevention interventions together with our partners. We have in 2020 started with kind of like to test through a laboratory where we invited different municipalities to see how area-based violence and crime prevention measures could be implemented and could also be institutionalized. Sprint by now, and in second phase, then I'm going to come to the board, is guided by an advisory group, which you can see here, of different national partners, such as the Department of Corporate Governance. You've heard Marvelous, who is the chair of the advisory group of Sprint, of Human Settlements, who is the co-chair. You've heard Monica earlier, of National Treasury, the Neighborhood Development Partnership Program in particular, SALGA colleagues, as well as colleagues that have started to be part of Sprint in the second phase, which was the Civilian Secretariat for Police Service, in particular around also the implementation and localization of the ICVPS, the Integrated Crime and Violence Prevention Strategy, and them as the custodian for that, as well as the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, in particular again here on the localization of the NSP and the comprehensive national prevention strategy. The advisory group, we've developed terms of reference, and there are particular roles and responsibilities also for the advisory group to support institutionalizing the different measures. The Isandla Institute and VPOU, and I come to that, I would say, is really also at the heart of implementation of Sprint, where through a partnership between us as VCP and the colleagues from the Violence Prevention through Urban Upgrading, VPUU, who are supporting us in particular with and throughout Sprint 1 and 2 with the capacitation, which you are all in here today as the first session, but also with mentoring and training, and to kind of like see how institutionalization of ABVPI, which is the abbreviation for area-based violence and crime prevention interventions, can really work between, also working between civil society and local government. And we have, of course, a number of local government and civil society sector here today to look in how does it really work. And this capacity building process should enhance, and as Marvelous said earlier, should also empower us to drive that within our own municipalities. VPUU is also mainly responsible for the implementation and for really testing some of these approaches, and to support us in particular with our advisory group at national level to institutionalize that such trainings and embed them into other opportunities, may it be within SALGA, may it be within DCOG around knowledge sharing, may it be in other tertiary educational system to offer short courses and to offer sort of like the institutionalization from a training perspective, I would say, on ABVPI. And a big heart, of course, also of implementation is really what is Isandla's role, who have been supporting us mainly and in this phase on the enabling conditions, as you can see here, which is part A, to drive and to align policies, to look at resources, to develop a number and a wealth, I would say, of different resources and practice briefs and learning briefs to support us with that, and to also really be and function as the secretariat for the advisory group, as well as the part B, as you can see here on the activation, to grow this and constantly growing number of participants in the community of practice through the learning network sessions. Many of you have been part of it, but also through the community of practice sessions. One we had in October, and another one we will have in May, which would mark also the end of the capacity building process. And all of you that are here in this room should have been invited. Just to maybe look at a little bit, and we will share the Miro board, but I just wanted to highlight, of course, there is a whole timeline of Sprint interventions and how we were able to support this and this whole journey that we sort of like went through. But I think it's important to say that, of course, in April 2022, we've started Sprint 2, and we will come to an end in June for the part of that Isandla is supporting us with, and we will come to an end with VPUU's support, in particular around the mentorship of the implementation of ABVPI at the end of the year, whilst the VCP program will come to an end, as many of you also know, in June 2024. Again, as I said, and then I'm going to finish, is that I will share the link of this Miro board. We will also work later on a little bit on that Miro board, but just to indicate that there is this wealth of knowledge here, and you will be able to click on the different practice briefs, on guides to designing integrated violence prevention interventions, and learning briefs. There are videos that we've been able to produce, advocacy papers, different articles, as well as a number of different situational analysis in some of our municipalities that we've worked with, and for some reason the resources to really understand on some of the what ABVPI is. We will talk about this, of course, today and in the coming weeks, but in a short version, I think there is this wealth of resources that you have and you will be able to find here. I think with that, I'm going to hand over back to the VPU colleagues. I wish you all, and I wish us all, fruitful conversations. I wish us also what Marvelous has said, that we are able to really be empowered to implement and to help in our own communities and in our own municipalities, within our civil society sector, and also from national and provincial government to support us institutionalizing on these violence and crime prevention measures at really a place-based where people are and where it's needed most to be able to support it. Thanks very much, and I'm handing over back to the colleagues.
So much, Thomas. We're going to go through a few house rules now before we start the modules. Please continue to have your microphone off until you're prompted to switch it on if you have a question or a comment. Those that do have access to the chat, please continue to make use of the chat and raise any issues and concerns on the chat. We are continuing to monitor it. Also, please raise your hand when you do have something to say. At the end of each module, you will be given a question answer session. So there will be an opportunity for you to raise questions on the module content at the end of each module and each training session. And at this moment, we have a few VPU colleagues in the room with me. I'm not alone. We are quickly going to switch on our cameras so you can see who's in the room with me from VPUU before we kick off the actual training.
Hi.
That is the whole team with me at the moment, and we'll be heading into now the actual content of the workshop. Thank you, colleagues. I'm gonna go through the agenda of the day briefly. So from 9:30 till 10, we had the onboarding, and we had an opportunity for everyone to introduce themselves. And we had brief introductions from cooperative governance, human settlements, as well as Thomas in terms of what Sprint is. Now we're gonna go into the first module, violence prevention theory and methodology, which will be done by Michael. Michael Kraus is a placemaker and urban designer who since 2006 has led a dedicated and transversal team that continuously shapes an area-based approach in low-income areas in South Africa to improve the quality of life as co-production between citizens, civil servants, and other dedicated partners. Michael is the CEO of Violence Prevention Through Urban Upgrading, a not-for-profit company, VPU NPC. I will be handing over to Michael now to begin the first module, and at the end of his presentation, he'll give you the opportunity to raise questions and we'll respond to those questions. After Michael's session, we will have a short 10-minute break, and upon our return, we will have Tanya, who will lead us through ABVPI and gender as the module until we close off. Thank you, guys. The training has now officially commenced.
Oh, great. Thanks very much, Fiona. Good morning, everybody. Great to have everybody here in the room. It's wonderful to be here. Unfortunately, as we know, we got some technical problems, but I'm sure the technical problems won't prevent us of having a good session. I would like to, before I start, I would just like to give a little bit of an indication that we also prepared a resource pack. The pack will be emailed to everybody after the session. Those who have access to the chat actually have access to that resource pack as well, but nobody will lose out. So today's session is really around setting the scene. So there will be a lot of input around some theory, and I really want to talk about the background and the context in which we operate as practitioners, be it in the public sector or in the civil society. And I see that we are over 70 people in this meeting, so it's really wonderful. I also want to go into the triangle of conflicts and the type of violence based on Galtung's conflict triangle and violence triangle, but also then talk a little bit about the response from the South, from the Global South, particularly from Jayakumar. Then I will go a little bit into crime prevention strategies. What can we do? And for many of you, it's a repetition probably of practices that you already run in your daily life. But I think it's important to do that. Then I want to look at particular tools at the built environment. So what can we do in the built environment? What are some of the tools? And people will be familiar with the crime prevention through environmental design, the CEPTED. The socio-ecological model is important for us for social crime prevention, and then also bringing it together with the intersectionality. And then, as Thomas said, sort of bringing it together in ABVPI, the Area-Based Violence Prevention Initiative. What are typical components of an ABVPI? So that's really what we're intending to do, and then finding the linkages to the integrated crime and violence prevention strategy. Just a little bit about the context. And when we think about violence in our society, it's really around inequality, and we have to acknowledge that inequality is an important risk factor, and we will talk a lot about risk factors and protective factors today as well, myself and Tanya. We also have to acknowledge that interpersonal violence is more concentrated in areas of poverty and deprivation. And we also need to acknowledge that the country we live in is one of the most unequal societies. So inequality is a big component of what we're dealing with, and is a source of violence that we deal with. So the World Bank of all organizations basically came to the conclusion at the end of last year that South Africa remains a dual economy with one of the highest and most persistent inequality rates in the world. There's a Gini coefficient of 0.67 in 2018. High inequality is perpetuated by a legacy of exclusion and the nature of economic growth, which is not pro-poor and does not generate sufficient jobs. I think we're all aware of that. Inequality in wealth is even higher, and intergenerational mobility is low, meaning inequalities are passed down from generation to generation with little change over time. And I think apartheid has perpetuated that situation. And I think we need to be cognizant that it takes a number of generations to undo that. So we got intergenerational poverty, intergenerational violence in some of the areas where we work. I heard that colleagues worked in some of the gang areas, Menenberg, Hanover Park, in the introduction. Those are typical areas where we have intergenerational violence we have to deal with. So the reality of our country is, and it's also World Bank information, is that we got an average income which is actually not too bad. The figures are in euro. So we're talking about 12,400 euros per annum. And the average wealth of about 3 times the annual income. And that's the average. But if you look at the bottom 50%, and that's most likely the areas where we work, the income is only a tenth of the average, the annual income. And actually the wealth is a negative income. That means people are indebted, and they're indebted more than an annual salary for themselves. And I think we need to be cognizant about that. So we got, and on the other side, we got a 10% at the top who earn about 7 times the average, and have a personal wealth of about 6 million rand each. We're talking about per person. So if you've got a couple, you're talking about a personal wealth of about 12 million rand, 276 approximately get to that amount. So that's the situation where we sit, and you can see that ratio between the top 10 and the bottom 50% is 1 to 63, meaning the top 10% earn 63 times more than the people at the bottom 50%. And bottom 50% is the majority. What we also observe is, and again, it's figures from the World Bank, is that there's a gap. The gap of the income is widening over the last couple of years. Since 2000, you can see the richer people got richer and the poorer people got poorer. So we shouldn't be, and those are pre-COVID figures. We all know the impact of COVID that has perpetuated that even higher. So that's the situation. That's the framework against we work. And if you look at the world scale, you can see that sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, the Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East are areas where the difference between the top 10 and the bottom 50 is very significant compared to the rest of the world. So we're sitting in one of the most difficult areas or unequal countries in the world. If you go on a city scale, and coming from Cape Town, would like to focus a little bit very briefly on Cape Town. What I can say on a general basis is on the left-hand side, you can see the murders, which is an indication for the crime rates. And you can almost overlay, or you can overlay the poorer areas have a higher rate of murder than the richer areas. And you can see that in the poorer areas, and I gave two examples, Nyanga and Khayelitsha, where we worked for a couple of years, the average murder rate is double the city average. That also shows you a divided city, which is just a reflection of a divided society we live. And then you got those multiple deprivations, which come into the transactional model later on as well. So we got a high level of crime, we got a backlog of public facilities, high level of crime, high level of poverty. So those are the areas of primary areas of intervention, obviously, for an ABVPI if we want to make a change.
Michael, you are on mute.
Thank you very much. I didn't know how to manage that, so I hope I don't have to start from the beginning.
Not from the beginning, Michael, but the previous slides, just from that multiple deprivation. Thank you very much.
This one, okay, sorry. I try not to hit any button, wrong button. Okay, what I was talking about is that we got multiple deprivations, and here you see a picture or a map of Cape Town, and you see a backlog of public facilities as encircled in the red areas. Then you can overlay that with the areas of poverty and the areas of crime. And basically, those should be your primary intervention areas if you want to do an intervention like an area-based violence prevention initiative or ABVPI. So what I was then pointing to is the Galtong's conflict triangle, and there are two elements to that, and that's how people think and how people act. And when we think about, or when we reflect on how people think, it is a lot around attitudes and assumptions. And we very quickly at one of the biggest problems in our society, which is racism and discrimination. But also Tanya will talk about gender. We talk about trauma. We talk about victimhoods. And there's some contradictions, and we got them in our country. The inequality, I spoke about that. And then also just think about the land question in the country that's still unresolved. So those are latent conflicts, how people think, and then obviously how people act is the behavior, and that we see in the levels of violence, that we can see in the service delivery protest, that we can see how people interact with each other. In our society and others, you can see genocide and insurgency attacks, if you just look at the neighboring countries, like Mozambique, for instance, where you got insurgency attacks in the northern part. Based on that triangle of conflict, Galtung also developed a triangle of violence, and many of you are familiar with the triangle of violence, which basically has three elements. You got the direct violence, which is the visible type of violence, and you got the two types of violence, cultural and structural violence, which are invisible types of violence. And just to give you a little bit of background what it means, direct violence is, for instance, a hitting, a beating, a shooting. It might be a rape, so very serious crimes. And then when we look at structural violence, it has to deal with the poverty levels in the country. I earlier spoke about access to public facilities. That's a form of structural violence. And also, obviously, the levels of corruption are also part of the structural violence. And in terms of cultural violence, I think we will later on talk about one particular element of that, and that's the gender. But it's also about how we treat the foreign nationals amongst us, etc. The answer from the South was, this is well and good to have the direct cultural and structural violence. We know we live there. But earlier on, I also spoke about intergenerational violence and trauma. So underlying, unfortunately, to all of that is the unhealed trauma. And I think that's one of the points and problems we haven't even started to address in South Africa. And if we don't address the unhealed trauma, we will not succeed in overcoming the structural violence, which is all around us, the cultural violence, which comes through the norms, and the direct violence, which we all concentrate on when the police statistics or the crime statistics are being presented on a quarterly level. So the point is, deal with the trauma. And that's very much what Jaya Kumar from India, a scholar from India, basically brought into the conversation. And I know sort of some of the CSOs and NGOs that are working with us here today are very much involved in that. So I can only encourage, carry on with your work. It's the most important work to do in our country right now. So what I would like to move on is really how that triangle of violence, the three types of violence, manifest itself in the physical space, which some people may say that's a bit of a long shot. I'll just give you an example of a situation, and I'm sure all of you have seen that situation. It's a typical township situation. This is a picture from Khayelitsha. It's a stormwater detention pond. So the idea is to basically hold water if there's a strong rain. But the reality is that's also the main pedestrian desire line to the train station. So about 15,000 people basically walk in the morning and in the evening back along that line. And you can imagine if you walk through that detention pond and you get mugged, when you cry help, nobody will turn to you because all the houses are put to the other side. Not a single window faces the pedestrian desire line. But 80% of the people in our low-income areas are actually pedestrians. That's the mode of transport. So the legacy really is the direct or the personal violence, which we see manifest itself as the high rates of contact crime and alcohol abuse. It is around the structural or the indirect violence, which is very much around exclusion, social, political, and economic exclusion. And it's around the cultural or the symbolic violence, the structural, the symbolic violence. It's around the insecurity and the fear of crime. It's around your ethnicity, your religion, or your gender, or sexual orientation. So same area, after a process of about 3 years of intensive consultation with the community, how to upgrade that very unsafe space into a safe space. So almost like the backyard has been turned into the front yard. And that's really what we need to do. We need to upside down our communities in order to have a change. And here there's a physical change, and obviously the social change takes much longer. So what we were aiming to do here is to transform by negotiating with the community as a partner and with local leadership to bring pride and citizenship in order to find common values so that people protect the assets that we put into the community and see the value as a positive value towards a safer community and improve the quality of life. Monica spoke about it in her introduction. So that leads us to a theory many of you know as well. It's also a triangle of violence that says there's three elements to it. You got a certain place, that's your environment, you got a victim, and you got an offender. So meaning if the place is not very safe, and if the victim is there as an opportunity and the offender is there, you will have most likely a crime by an offender to a victim in a particular space. So what can we do to change that space? And you can imagine, as I mentioned earlier on, if there is no window, if there's no passive surveillance, as we say in urban design, it is very difficult for people to intervene and interact. So therefore, it's important to have visibility, have all those elements of the crime prevention of through environmental design, the urban management comes in, and so forth. So that's really the question, how can we interrupt this triangle? I want to come back to what I said earlier on, that we deal with the highest rates of inequality in our society and with a legacy of exclusion, not just immediate, but also the intergenerational exclusion, and we need to undo that. So from our perspective, there are three strategies. And the three strategies are called situational crime prevention, where we change the built environment to the form. And I think we got with the IUDF and many interventions, we got really, really good and groundbreaking policies for that. We have to deal with the social crime, the second element is social crime prevention, and the integrated crime and safety strategy has really put a lot into there. That's really the relationship between the offender and the victim. And it's around the institutional crime prevention. That's probably the most difficult one because it goes into power relationships. And that's on a very localized level, all the way up to national and international relationships, where you have different powers at play. So I would like to give a little bit of an intro into the situational crime prevention and move on to social crime prevention. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about institutional crime prevention. So I'm staying in the area, and many of you do crime mapping. So this is just a crime map that we did. Could be anywhere. The different dots identify different types of violence. And basically, the element is to go to what types of crime hotspots are we experiencing in our communities. We overlaid that to the desired location, where we asked through a household survey, what is your desired location? What are the destinations in your community? And you can see, if you overlay that, the destinations or the desired locations are often also the areas where crime does happen. And it has to deal with that offender, the victim, and the opportunity in a space, because our spaces, our public spaces are not well designed. So they are easy. Potential victims are easy targets for potential offenders. The big point is, if you do an intervention like that, speak to your community and listen. Don't overtalk, don't talk to them, listen to them, because the information is really within that community. And get yourself educated what's happening. So that's what we did, and communities identified, verified, is what we did via household survey. The crime locations, they then verified and said those are the main crime hotspots. And it's quite important from those hotspots then to actually go into an urban design framework, which you can see on the right-hand side, which we developed as a type of precinct. So each of those things, and you can see a school, you can see a public park, you can see a town center, and you can see a train station here in that overview, for instance. And those are specific precincts which are now much more welcoming.
Michael, you went AWOL again. Michael, you went on mute. Please unmute.
Okay, colleagues, thanks to load shedding, and we thought that we had solar backup. We do have solar backup. Trying to come back here. I'm just trying to find a presentation again. Okay. I hope it's coming out. It's coming back. Thank you very much. So I was saying basically everything is then knitted together like a chain along a pedestrian desire line here in that particular element in that particular setting, which is the Harare Safe Node. But what I wanted to focus on is also just this element of how do we identify hotspots, how do we analyze hotspots, because not every situation requires the same solutions. I would like us to be mindful of that we have different types of hotspots, and people are most likely familiar, some of you, is that we got three types of geographical hotspots. It's namely a dot, and maybe you think about a throughlet. You got a channel where you move from one side to the other side, and that's basically a dot, relatively easy for an offender to find a victim and get mugged. We got those little alleyways that we're all uncomfortable to enter into. Then we got a line that might be your pedestrian walkway through an sort of coordinated area. It's not really well overlooked. And I gave an example with this with the park early on. And then you may have an area where a whole area, and the example that I show here in the presentation is, for instance, the location of 57 Shebeens in one informal settlement. So you can imagine navigating through that space as a woman is almost impossible after a certain hour. So that area has become a hot area. And then we got three types of, from a criminological and social perspective, three types of hotspots. It could either be a crime generator, it could be an attractor or an enabler. So in essence, you got 9 options, 3 times 3. I don't want to spend too much time, you get it with the presentation, but just to give a little bit of input, what is a crime generator? That's, for instance, a place like a train station where a large number of people are attracted. The large number of crime and disorder events is due principally to the use of the place. So that allows an opportunity for the offender and the target. Train station, shopping area, I think we're all familiar with that. And how do you respond to it? And that's the second last column, is, for instance, for an increase in protection. That's what you want to do in an area that's a crime generator. In a crime attractor, that is a place that's affording many criminals opportunities that are well known to offenders. And people with a criminal motive actually come to such places. And often it's areas where drug is sold, or where we got prostitution, or we got entertainment hotspots. So areas, again, where people gather, there's some illegal activity, and people actually know, so they can make a relatively easy buck as an offender. So there, obviously, the intervention is slightly different. You need to discourage people of coming to those spaces, in particular the offenders. And then you got a crime enabler, and it's really areas where the rule of law has basically deteriorated, where you don't have what we call place management or urban management. And there you actually need to restore your guardianship. So it's important with urban management, for instance, you can manage relatively easy areas that are called crime enablers, and the same as crime generators. That's relatively easy to do. But you need to know what is the intervention, and on the far right, you can see a number of questions that you probably want to ask if you're in a situation like that. So I just want to give you 2 quick examples with the line. Basically, that's that line that I showed earlier on. It is the pedestrian desire line, which is relatively unsafe, or was relatively unsafe for people to navigate through to the train station from their place of home, of residence. And the intervention was a safe pedestrian desire line, safe pedestrian walkway, well lit, patrolled by community patrols, and those precincts which are safe spaces. So you almost like your next safe space in a case of uncertainty and insecurity. If you look at an area, and we work particularly in an area as a town center, the intervention is quite, it's similar, but also quite different, because you want to basically make that space. And you can see that's how it looked before the intervention, an unstructured space. I'm sure we got in all of our townships, we got a space like that. And it was important to give a framing for the space and also make sure that the space is utilized 24/7. So it's a mixed use space. As you can see, it's a number of users that are there, from a business hive, from a library, from a supermarket, public facilities, the post office. It's now no longer the post office, an early childhood development center, but then also the live-work unit, so that people live right onto the square. So in places where in times when the shops are closed, you got that passive surveillance over the square. So that's important to do if you want to deal with an area. Make sure that it's positively occupied and it's meaningful occupied. Obviously, we all do that in order to build social cohesion and to do evidence-led interventions. So in terms of what I wanted to basically share with you in that situational crime prevention component here was looking at crime hotspot analyzing as one of the elements that you can do, as one of the tools in order to prepare your built interventions. And you can see what it is. You can focus your resources. You can make data-driven decision making. On the right-hand side, you see an example of crime hotspotting that was done with the Neighborhood Watch in Site C, also in Khayelitsha a couple of years ago. And you see all 3 types within one neighborhood. So you can see very clearly the line along a particular road. You can see the area around the transport interchange, and you can see that dot, which is a bridge over the N2 over a highway. So you got all 3 in one neighborhood, and now you got your ingredients to do an area-based violence prevention initiative. So I would encourage people to do that kind of analysis. If you come back in a couple of years to see whether crime has shifted, whether you reduced crime, and how you can basically counter those patterns of violence. I don't really want to go, there's a lot of research and documentation around the CEPTED, the crime prevention through environmental design, well publicized by the CSIR here in South Africa. You know the principles, I'm repeating them briefly. It's really surveillance and visibility. So do we have eyes on the street? Is it easy for people to navigate? Is it clear? It's the own spaces, avoid spaces that nobody takes ownership. A typical example is in our townships that we got public spaces and we got private spaces. That intermediate space, the stup in inverted commas, is missing. So how can we create stups in our townships? And we saw some examples how we did that with zones in between, a play park close to a facility. Third point is around really defined access and safe movement routes to make it very easy for strangers to navigate through a neighborhood. Very good street signage, very clear indicators, maybe some landmarks so that you move from one point to another point. It's very clear. Image and aesthetics, don't save on money because it's poor people. It's important that in poor neighborhoods, we put the same infrastructure like we put in affluent neighborhoods, that we have one city and not 2 different or a divided city. Physical barriers, Some people call it target hardening in some languages. So that's basically your increased safety, security features, might be burglar guards, etc. But physical barriers is also the nicer word. Then our urban management, operation maintenance and management. And one thing that's often forgotten is the inclusive design. So how do people with different abilities navigate to space? How do we look for particular groups? And Tanya will talk about this inclusive design from a gender lens, for instance. But there's other lenses as well, children, people with different abilities. So I would like to move on to social crime prevention and now to get into what is behind social crime prevention as the second intervention from our perspective, how you can tackle and counter that triangle of violence. And it takes us to the socio-ecological model, which is basically a model that looks at different spheres. And we can separate in 4 spheres. It's the individual level, it's the relationship, often also the family, it's the community, and it's the society. So when you plan an intervention, many of our colleagues will do that, be quite clear at what level do you want to intervene. So if you intervene on an individual level, you need to design it differently than if you want to have an impact on a society level. So on an individual level, if you run a project, a social crime prevention project, you need to address the specific conditions of the individual. So typical interventions are, for instance, mental health interventions, the trauma for an individual, the livelihood or cognitive development, i.e. your ECD intervention, your school-based intervention, and so forth is quite important here. The relational level is often also the peer or the family, and then you need to see how can you basically break those dynamics that work towards violence. Domestic violence is a typical intervention of rather than anti-domestic violence. It's parenting skills if you sit in the ECD sector, and it's also conflict resolution in a particular peer group or in a family. Community level, and that's often where we intervene as the ABBPI team is, really you look at local perceptions and challenges which are specific to a neighborhood or a particular area. So elements that are usually there is the social cohesion. How can you improve social cohesion? School safety interventions is obviously a mix between the 3 levels, individual, relational, and community level. Well, it's also how do we create livelihoods to tackle the unemployment, for instance. So you can see that as you intervene on a particular level, your design of the program needs to look slightly different. On a society level, you obviously now have to deal at a very broad level, and that's really where you start to address the beliefs, the culture, attitudes, institutional conditions, and you actually go into the legislation and into the norms of particular behaviors. So that obviously takes us very closely back to the power relationships. So if you intervene on a society level, you have to do a lot with institutional crime prevention and the power relationships. Obviously, power relationships are important for all 4 levels, but be mindful when you go to that 4th level. And some of us, national government, that's your sphere of influence, and that's basically your play part on that level. So bringing it all together is look at the 4 levels: the individual, the relationship, the community, and the society as such. In the next session next week, my colleague Petang Mabeba will talk a little bit how we apply this socio-ecological model in the early childhood development. So how we address different levels, the first 3 levels of individual, relationship, and community. When we talk about social crime prevention, there's also that question around the risk factors and the protective factors. And I would like us to just sit a little bit in that, just to reflect on various risk factors. And risk factors are often described as what is a factor, what is a risk factor that either makes you a perpetrator or could potentially make me a victim of violence. And right at the introduction, when we framed our conditions here in South Africa, we spoke very much around inequality and poverty and deprivation. But there's the typical suspects of alcohol and substance abuse. If you look in what it does to our communities, it's the socio-economical status of a household could be a risk factor. It could be the social capital of a whole community, because you're coming from an area, the likelihood that you become a perpetrator or a victim is significantly higher than in another community. And I've given some examples at the beginning for that. But it's also often the weak economic safety net, and we saw the weakness of our economic safety net during COVID in particular and what it did to our communities. It could be the absence or the poor rule of law. Could be the high corruption. It is gender inequalities. And it could be also psychiatric disorders that are seen as risk factors. So those are the typical risk factors, and I'm sure that you've got other risk factors and probably reconfirm some of those risk factors. And how do we counter those risk factors in that socio-ecological model? So on an individual level, you actually want to give people skills and jobs and inculcate pro-social attitudes and beliefs. And education is a very good intervention for that individual level to strengthen the protective factor. If we look at the family or the peers, we can see that psychosocial support is important. It's important around how the children are being brought up, their cognitive skills, and we know what alcohol does, the alcohol syndrome on children, for instance, and their cognitive level and skills. So it's important that we start there and fostering those family bonds. On a community level, and that's the interaction where we often want to have an impact, is to basically promote non-violent values. Are we going into schools? Are we talking in our conversations? Are we encouraging our leaders to do non-violent conflict resolution? Or does it all become an open conflict? Reminding ourselves, strengthening that non-violent values that are so important. But it's also building the social capital, a community that has a strong social capital, that got resources at their hands, obviously can counter a potential risk and a threat much easier than a community that does not have the social capital. And it's really encouraging that working together. So hence it's so important, if you have an intervention, and if you want to strengthen those protective factors, is giving a voice to the voiceless, working with communities, working with leaders. Don't be shy to ask people to acknowledge that you are not the expert. Talk and listen, and really encourage that working together. Sometimes it's a detour you have to take, but it's more sustainable. So please, when you design a program around protective factors and around a community, don't come with a ready-made solution. Always keep the door open for changes, because that's really what will change our communities. On a society and an institution, it's really how do we change the norms against violence? How do we upkeep policing? And how transparent and how accountable are we? Are we sharing successes and failures? Are we transparent around that? Are we making ourselves vulnerable, or are we the expert that knows everything? So those are really protective factors that can counter some of those risks. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of the protective tools. And as I said, in the next session, we'll look at two particular ones: the early childhood development, and one that's really the security of tenure and informal settlements. And the colleagues that have the opportunity to be at the face-to-face here in May will be taken to 4 more protective tools on how to counter some of the risks. I don't really want to go through the protective tools necessarily. So bringing it all together, so we got a triangle of conflict, we got a triangle of violence. We are aware of the situation around us, the inequalities. There's something that came up from the States by a lady called Kimberly Crenshaw, which is intersectionality. That's bringing it together and is actually saying that all of us are privileged and also marginalized at the same time. And there are different elements to that. And we sometimes got privileged because of our race, or because of our body size maybe, or because of our gender, or because of our ethnicity, or because of our education. But we also be marginalized for the very same reasons, because we're not of the race, we do not have a certain ethnicity, we don't have a certain gender, etc. So it's often important when you go into conversations with leaders to make that visible. While we know that people are deprived and we got this multitude of deprivations, there's also privilege, and work on that, work on encouraging people to see both sides of the coin. On the one hand side, the marginalization, but then also the protective factors that sit within that community. And that's for me the beauty about that model of intersectionality, is not just looking on one side, it's also looking on one side, it's also looking on the other side. So what have we got? So that you have the half full glass, not the half empty glass in front of you. So what I would like to bring it all together is, so how does all this theory now actually have been incorporated in the area-based violence and violence prevention initiative that the GIZ and you, all of you in the room, have been working on for the last couple of years around a safer community. And the colleagues from Isandla presented that so nicely, put it all together. So we got those safe streets, and maybe you recall when I spoke about it, safe pedestrian desire line in Harare, which is well lit, where you have the non-motorized transport routes. They basically check that none of the spaces are derelict spaces, so they're all managed, etc. You got your surveillance. And maybe you got a walking bus that takes kids to the school or people safely to the train station. You're looking for functional precincts. So that could be your transport nodes, that could be your public spaces, your trading infrastructure. Mixed use is very important for that. And I've given an example, Mr. Harare Square. You got your social facilities as a third element for that. So what are the protective factors in our communities, the schools, the clinics, the community halls, the ECDs, you name it, the churches, the places of worship, sport fields, and so forth. It's the livelihood, the economic activity and building that livelihood. How do we do that? Don't see informal traders as a problem. They're part of the solution. We've proven that in a response program towards COVID, where the Spaza shops and the informal traders was the means of disseminating vouchers into the community. We were able to distribute 400,000 rand per community per week over 11 months. So it was a big program. 30,000 families basically were supported through Spaza shops. So look at the opportunities that emerge with something that you potentially see as a problem. It's the food gardens. It's the basic services, your water, your electricity, and so forth. It's the education and training, very important. We spoke about it at the protective factors. It starts all the way with early childhood development, so that lifelong learning, ECD, school-based interventions, and adult-based education, your skills development program, etc. It is your activation and your community life. So once you got your safe street and your social facilities, how do we activate it? How do we make sure that communities can express themselves, that facilities are activated? And that could be your social events, it could be a sustained youth development programs, it can be your clubs, etc., you name it. And in the security and justice and care, and it's really how do we work with the law enforcement agencies on the one hand side, so the legislated, and what are the community responses to that? So that's your neighborhood patrols. But it's also caring. So it's not just enforcement, it's also caring. That's your referral system. What are your key referral systems in your community that you want to strengthen? And there's many in your community. So that mapping is important of the stakeholders in your community. So I would like to conclude my part just reflecting a little bit on what has been developed over the last couple of years, and many of us have been part of the development initially of the white paper on safety and security, which then found its way into an integrated crime and violence prevention strategy, which is now a national document. And it's really good. And we got those 6 themes that start with active public and community participation, talks about victim support, talks about early interventions to prevent crime and violence and to promote safety. It's the effective and integrated service delivery for safety. It's the SEPTED principles, the safety through environmental design. And it also looks at the effective criminal justice system. And that found its way in the Integrated Crime and Violence Prevention Strategy, which was published last year. Big event for all of us. And it all found its way in a nice diagram here. And I'm sure that Yogeshni will touch on that as well in 2 weeks' time when she talks about the role of local government. But this one is aligned to the national outcome. All people in South Africa are and feel safe. So I just want to encourage that actually from a legislative, from a framework perspective, we've got all the ingredients here in South Africa. There's no reason not to start a crime prevention intervention. We got a good understanding of what needs to be done. We're relatively well advanced in terms of evidence-based and data collection. All our communities, we've got champions that can collect data, that can help us to frame. And we got an open public sector, and we got a very lively civil society. So that co-production between public sector and civil society and community leaders is relatively easy to do with the ingredients that we do. In the implementation, it is hard labor, we all know, but the elements are here, so the ingredients are here. So I would like to encourage us to start our interventions and not wait for it. So just in conclusion, just a little bit looking back, we spoke about the visible and the hidden violence. We spoke about direct culture and structural violence. But we also know that the unhealed trauma is unfortunately the basis, and we have to get to the basis of that in order to tackle the others. And that's a long-term intervention. We spoke about risk factors, protective factors and protective tools. And we'll go a little bit into some examples next week and then in the face-to-face. And I would like to encourage in the last 5 minutes in probably some question and answers. Maybe some of you want to reflect. Are those risk factors, are you aware of them in the place of work, in those interventions that you run? Are there other risk factors you would like to add to the risk factors? And what are protective factors which you think are good to mitigating some of the risk factors? With that, I would really like to thank everybody and hand back to Fiona. Thank you.
Hello again, everyone. This is the opportunity that you'll be given to ask questions on the content of the module that we've just had. We will be taking the questions one by one, and Michael will be responding to each. And I'm prompting again the last thought that he's indicated to us. If there are any responses to the question that he's raised himself. And if you have access to the chat and you'd rather make the comment or the question on the chat, we are still monitoring the chat. That is open to you as well. I will be addressing each hand that comes up and giving the opportunity to speak to each person one by one as they come up. The floor is open to all participants now to respond to Michael's question at the end and also to raise questions on the content of the module that we've just heard. Thank you. It is also an opportunity to give comment or feedback on the overall module as well. Any issues, anything. The floor is open to comment. Thank you. Zolega, you may proceed.
Thank you very much. The question is, what comes first, a principed plan or a crime prevention strategy? So where do we start? Do we start with the principed plan, or do we start with these things I have to be addressed simultaneously?
Thank you, Zolega.
I think that's a very good question, Zolega. I think both. I think you want to start with a strategy, and you want to start with an overarching strategy of what needs to be addressed. So my recommendation would be have a conversation with the communities and the stakeholders. And usually one starts with social interventions, and the build interventions follow suit, because there's a period of planning and approvals and so forth, and we're all aware of that. So if you can focus as the initial one on livelihoods, for instance, building livelihoods while we're defining the precinct plan, while we're defining the upgrading plans, etc. And don't spend too much time. We will never have the perfect plan. I think that's one of our problems, that we always want to have the perfect plan. Start somewhere, but make sure that you base it on a form of evidence that you gather from the community, from the stakeholders involved. So, for instance, if you think at informal settlements, speak to the colleagues in the informal settlements, what is important to them. And it might be simple interventions just to make sure that the water taps that are provided are functioning. And then you build around there a safe passage for children to and from schools with a walking bus could be an intervention. And then over time, while we're implementing the first interventions, people then can start with the precinct plan. That would be my advice. And I know sometimes the budget is actually quite pressuring because you have to spend budget. But try to follow that. First, build leadership and then go into the build intervention.
Before I move on to the next hand, I just also wanted to remind you, once your question has been responded to, please put down your hand so that we don't go back to old hands. Humla, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Fiona. I just want to thank Mike first for putting a name to some of the questions that I had. The triangle of violence is one of those, because from time to time you are never sure about a number of things. But I just want to say, in our province, what we have done, I am actually from the Eastern Cape. On the basis of the ICVPS, we then developed a provincial safety strategy, utilizing the very same 6 pillars of that strategy. And then maybe then what we will need to do in terms of ensuring that there are local plans, probably we need to first start with the local municipality plan. I'll take a municipal boundary. We will have to do that first. And then after that, then the area-based plans. But then, as Mike said, there are issues of budget. But then you start small and you build up on that. So that's why I was saying, I'm not sure whether it's a question or a comment, but thank you very much. Some things have become very clear.
I think you hit the nail on its head. It's important to start, and it's important to take people along with you. It's a long journey. I mean, we know intergenerational violence and deprivation, we won't undo in 3 or 5 years. But it's important to start, and I like your approach, which is a top-down to a certain extent. So from the strategic, narrowing it down. It might be good also to start from the bottom up at the same time. So if there is a community ready, go and partner with them. Do something on a local area while you're still dealing on a municipal level, etc. Because it takes time, as we know. And start small, you're 100% right. Thanks.
We currently have 2 hands up, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to limit the questions to the 2 hands that we currently have because of time restrictions. Any other comments and any other questions can be raised in the chat and will be responded to in the chat. Jabulo, you have the floor. Jabulo, are you still with us?
We can't hear you. We can see that your mic is open, but we can't hear you. Are you able to type it into the chat maybe?
While we wait for Jabulo, we will move on to Regan. Regan, can you please ask your question or make your comment? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Michael, this is more of a practical question. When you are doing physical builds in communities, to what extent have you encountered the construction mafia? And if you have, how have you dealt with that effectively? Because we are getting it more and more in communities where we are trying to do work and then we have to navigate other elements over and above the ordinary community mobilization and activation. So I'd like to know from your side, how have you dealt with this in your physical builds?
Yeah, Regan, very good point. And it's really there's no golden answer. It's really, and I'm very aware of that. We built facilities, large facilities in Delft, in some of the communities where we see the construction mafia being quite active. The point is not to pay protection money and really enroll the communities, working with community leaders. At the end, you're not going into an area if the community is not strong enough to withhold the construction mafia. And I know that's easier to say for people that are not sitting in government compared to people that sit in government. So what we try to do is we try to avoid large-scale projects and make sure that many community members, through subcontracting, through local beneficiation, benefits to that. That's important, but I know it's easier to say from the outside, but I think you're from the Department of Community Safety, right? You're from the Western Cape.
No, from NICRO.
Oh, from NICRO. Oh, sorry. Okay, no problem. I thought you were, yeah, in the Western Cape, it's quite a severe problem. Community leaders need to stand up, and we've also cancelled projects and not gone into. Once you start, you're on a slippery slope. You don't get out of it. And that's really what it is. And you need to convince community leaders to stand up and say it's for the community. We had situations where people tried, but I can say with a good conscience, with a clear conscience, you're not paying protection money.
Okay.
And I would encourage people not to start that. And I know there are those needs, desires, and pressures, and it's tough. I know.
Okay, thank you. It's good to hear that you draw that line and that you're firm in it, and yet you still go on to be successful. I think it's very good to hear that being said, that the community must also come forward and take some responsibility. And if that broad-based support isn't there, then you can move on to another community. Unfortunately, that decision, that stand has to be taken at some point. So thank you.
Yeah, I think it's important not to penalize communities. So always stay in contact. And what we do in some of the communities where we are unable to do build interventions, strengthen the protective factors, and that's social interventions. So in some of them, I wouldn't give the names, in some of the communities, it's quite rife. And we are able to work, for instance, in the ECD sector. And we run a quite successful ECD program in an area in a neighborhood where protection, extortion is quite high, quite rampant. Okay. And the community is aware of that, and they know exactly where we draw the line. And I can only encourage people to work with the structures that are willing to go that way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Regan. We have lost Jabulo, so we will be moving on now to our break. Our break is no longer 10 minutes. We have reduced it to 5 minutes because we had quite an interactive session with the questions and the responses from Michael. So I'm I'm closing off now for 5 minutes, and we will resume again at 11:40 to continue with the second part of the workshop. Thank you all. We'll see you in a few minutes until 11:40. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's time to get back into it again. We are moving on to our next module now, ABVPI and Gender by Tanya. So Dr. Tanya Jacobs is a gender expert working in research and practice to advance gender equality and social justice. She is currently the gender and intersectionality expert for the inclusive and gender transformative work of the Inclusive Violence and Crime Prevention VCP program. Tanya has 25 years of experience working across the interrelated areas of gender-based violence prevention and response, as well as public health, while working with a range of stakeholders. Tanya, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Fiona. Warm greetings, everyone. I trust that you can hear me. I'm really excited about being with you today and sharing and learning together as part of this learning network in this community of practice. My focus will be on issues of gender and intersectionality, and also in terms of what we can do as a collective. So really, many of us have encountered and met each other at the D4UC meetings, at the Urban Safety Reference Group meetings, at the SALGA meetings, or in NGO activist spaces. For some of you, what I'm going to share today may be the first time. For some of you, may be experts in the field. But I think together, and only together, we can make a difference in terms of area-based violence prevention and gender intersectionality. So I invite you to learn, engage, and hopefully this will be the beginning of us all working together. I know my time is very short today, and I invite you, particularly as a resource person to the VCP program, to draw on me for future discussions, for workshops, for opportunities for us to take this forward. Just trying to move the slides. There we go. So briefly, we're going to be looking at some key concepts related to gender and area-based violence prevention. We're going to focus on issues of gender integration, particularly gender transformative approaches, as well as intersectionality. I'm going to share some tools and resources for you. And also importantly, we're going to have a chance to discuss. So my presentation will be about 20 minutes, and then we'll break into 3 groups with some key questions for you to engage with. And I please invite you to stay with us for the whole period. So I think our colleague in the beginning mentioned that we're operating in a global context. We know from the SDG goals that currently we're far behind in achieving all our targets, particularly the gender targets. And we know that gender is a standalone goal as well as a cross-cutting goal. And I think that's one of my key messages for today is even though this message, this workshop is focusing on gender, it should be a cross-cutting theme in all our understandings, in all future workshops, in all opportunities that you have to implement what you're doing. Thank you. We also know from global research in our own country that gender-based violence and violence against women is a key issue in our country. And similarly to us, many other colleagues around the world are grappling and working together in terms of what it takes to create safe cities, safe public spaces where everybody feels included and feels part of that society. Just a quick recap, we have important global goals. We also have the Constitution, which enshrines critical rights in terms of human rights and the right to live free from violence. And we have a very powerful national legal and policy framework. Michael mentioned the ICVPS. We have, for the first time ever, a national strategic plan that can guide and help us localize our work. But we also know from our daily readings of the newspaper and from our readings of the State of Urban Safety report, for example, that gender-based violence is a fundamental violation of human rights. It's present in our homes, in our streets, in our public spaces. Not only the experiences of violence, but also the fear of violence shapes our everyday lived experiences. And we also know that COVID has exacerbated and made more visible different forms of violence. So that's an important national discourse for us to engage with as well. In terms of gender and violence, as I mentioned, it's deeply entrenched in our society. Some people talk about it as a second pandemic. It's really not separate from anything of COVID. But we could say that all types of violence are gendered because of how gender power inequalities are entrenched in our society. We also know that because of those different forms of inequality, some groups, particularly women, young girls, and those from the LGBTQI+ communities are more vulnerable. And we can't see everybody as the same in terms of their marginalization and vulnerability. And we also know that perpetrators come in different forms. They can be our teachers, our partners, as well as strangers on the street. So why am I talking with you today? I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that space is not neutral. The way each one of us experiences space depends on our history, our context, our systems of oppression and violation we experience. It's really important for us to think as planners and those working in area-based violence prevention to think not only about the physical structure, but also the social and political spaces that we are creating. And based on gender and other inequalities, it's really important to put people front and center in terms of our initiatives. Gender is closely related to area-based violence initiatives because that process and commitment is also based on evidence and inclusive processes that address root causes. So when we think about gender and area-based violence prevention, that's a key message as well, is that we need to begin to address the root causes of gendered inequality. And if we start doing that, if we start creating the different voices and the different experiences, we make sure that everybody's needs are met and everybody feels safe in their neighborhoods. I mentioned the NSP. I will invite you all to read it in detail if you haven't. I know there are colleagues from government here. There are also colleagues from civil society. All of us have a tool and are coming together to really localize this. And particularly relevant to us is Pillar 2, which is focusing on prevention. Michael mentioned the socio-ecological model and the National Crime Prevention Strategy. It's also centered on this notion of different risk and protective factors, and that we really need to think across that entire socio-ecological model to begin to identify where those risk factors are, how they collide, and where our initiatives are based. And I think importantly for our work, you may feel that you're working, I know colleagues are here from the Eastern Cape, others are here from eThekwini, others are working at the policy level, others are working at the issues related to trauma and history. And I think it's very important that we recognize that not one of us in our different spheres or our interventions can prevent violence by itself. It's really important that we understand where our work is located, how our work across the continuum complements and supports what others are doing, and really begin to use the ecological framework as beginning to align over time all our efforts. Michael also mentioned positive and risk factors, and this is drawn particularly from the Sprint material. And I should say here, I know Thomas mentioned in the beginning, but the Sprint materials are a great resource. They really provide very important learning briefs. They have a focus on gender, they have a focus on power. So I really would advocate that you, if you have not yet, take some time to read them because they go into depth and detail, which I can't cover today, but happy to take forward with you in terms of the conversation. I think what's really critical for us today, again, is around what opportunities we have to localize the NSP. So really, we have the NSP, we have the National Crime Prevention Strategy. colleagues earlier mentioned from the Eastern Cape, the ICVPS, we have an opportunity to really localize and to understand what it looks like in my local municipality. How can I partner across NGOs and government to make it happen? How can I focus on transforming and disrupting power systems? So I think, again, this is a big conversation, but we have for the first time through our work an opportunity to localize. I'm going to just briefly talk through some key concepts. And again, I want to reiterate that these concepts in and of themselves constitute a workshop because they're complex and they're not abstract, they're part of our lives. But because of limited time, I'm going to really just whiz through them and then give us some time to look at tools and resources. So here on the screen are many concepts. Some of you may be familiar with them, some of you may be the first time. Michael mentioned intersectionality. Again, there's a huge body of work that underpins that. We could spend a whole 3 days talking about power, about sexual orientation and gender identity. But these are all key concepts that I would encourage you to be familiar with. And if you want me to share glossaries of terms, etc., I'm really happy to do this. But these are key terms when we talk about gender and particularly power in our work to prevent violence. I think a key concept that people often confuse is that they equate biological sex with gender. And I think it's really important that we have time to understand that gender is something that's socially constructed. So it's how we learn through our society what the norms, roles, behaviors, power relationships are. And that can differ from different countries to different contexts. And given the fact that it's socially constructed, these power relations can also be changed and transformed. So I think that's a really important point that I want to make in relation to gender. Another whole workshop topic, again, is the issue of power. Michael touched briefly on that, but there are different kinds of power, and power over is often the power that we are most familiar with. Power to is kind of what we're doing today through capacitating ourselves. Power with is how we together confront and challenge issues like area-based violence. We're also important to, I think Michael spoke about the different, what's visible, what's hidden, and similarly with spaces of power, there often are invisible forms of power which shape how we behave. And that's really where the issues of ideology, inequality, homophobia, xenophobia, racism, all of those invisible forms of power shape and determine what we feel is acceptable or not in our society. Let me just pause here as well. Michael mentioned intersectionality, and I'd like to build on what he says, because I think intersectionality is really important, that it's not about separate systems of power, but it's how power and systems of oppression come together and compound each other, so make it worse. So we can't only look at issues of gender without looking at issues of race, without looking at issues of ability, without looking at issues of sexual orientation. If we did that, we would only be seeing half the picture. So what this means for us in terms of violence prevention is that it really, and building on our policy documents, it gives us a situation where we can understand the full picture of how violence shows up in our lives, and to really begin to change our understandings of where to begin to address systems of oppression in order to leave no one behind. So a quick run through concepts, but I know many of you are practitioners and you want to start moving into what can we do. And again, I'd refer you to some of the excellent Sprint learning briefs and practice briefs that really begin to document a lot that has been learned and documented over the time. Okay, I've got 5 minutes left. I think most importantly, it's always good to start with an analysis. And Michael also emphasized the importance of evidence-informed, evidence-based. So ideally, a gender and intersection analysis complemented with issues of power, stakeholder analysis, and most importantly, participatory assessments, how we understand bottom-up processes, how we listen as practitioners to what people's experiences of violence are. Here I'm sharing with you the continuum of gender integration. And again, we can look at our work that really actively reinforces gender inequalities on one end of the continuum to our work on the other end of the continuum, which really begins to address the root causes and power relations. And I'm going to invite you later on to think about where you would place your work along this continuum. I think the important point here is that if we are not thinking about gender and intersectionality, I would argue our work is gender blind. And again, invitation for us to build on that and move forward. A critical part of our work moving forward is gender transformative approaches, which is on the right end of the continuum. And that really begins to address the underlying social structures, the power relations, and really begins to build on positive norms around masculinities, for example. And again, we could have a whole workshop on that. Here are some criteria which you can use to map your work. I'm going to move on. I think the next few slides just begin to share with you some ideas that you can do across the intersectionality and gender integration for area-based violence prevention. So when, for example, you assemble the various stakeholders, make sure that you reach out to women, girls, and gender non-binary people, identify women as development planners, for example. When you assign roles and responsibilities, make sure that those are fair and equitable. When you look for evidence-based community information, make sure that you collect gender and age disaggregated data, speak to a range of actors, including focus groups with women, girls, and those from the LGBTQI community. And when you develop budgets, allocate sufficient resources to gender-specific and gender-inclusive projects. These are all in your sprint resources. So I have just highlighted these, and I invite you again to go and read more in terms of what opportunities there are for you. Again, the issue of the monitoring and evaluation system, develop flexible methods where you begin to hear and hear from the voices of a diverse community in terms of what the experiences are, what the picture looks like on the ground. The next few slides that I'm not going to show with you, but share with you, is a really expansive evidence base of the work that we have. And these will be made available to you for you to look at and to build on best practices and knowledge that we have in the sector. My time is very limited, so I'm going to take us through to a group work discussion. But again, there are excellent resources out there. I'm happy to work with you and do workshops with you in terms of what they mean for your context. There are different examples from great cities. So I think, yeah, let's build on that. And here's a resource list, which I'll also share with you. I really want us to have a chance to discuss a little bit and hear your voices, not only my voices in this room. And so what we're going to be doing for about 20 minutes, I think, if we have time, I'm just looking at my co-facilitators, we'll go into 3 groups. Myself, Thomas, and Yoshi will be a facilitator and just creating space for us to talk. So if you think about your work, would you place it on being gender blind or gender transformative? Where would you place your current work on the continuum? What opportunities are there for you to strengthen and integrate gender and intersectionality more in your work, given these 8 elements of area-based violence prevention? And then because we're a learning network and we want to be working together, what else would you like to know and for us to discuss moving forward? So just some group work to get the conversation going and really invite you to share your ideas and for us to begin the conversation of how we together, collectively as civil society, government, at different levels can work together to make sure that we really integrate gender and intersectionality in all aspects of our work. So that was a whiz tour of concepts and ideas. And I really invite you to reach out to me through the Violence and Crime Prevention Program if you want more workshops, if you want more resources, and hopefully we can continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Just continue and just explain.
All right, we're going to be going into 3 groups. So I will just give my colleagues a few minutes to randomly assign us to 3 groups. As I said again, there are no right or wrong answers. We just want to create a space in the time that we've got allocated to hear your ideas. Maybe you have some brilliant ideas, or maybe for you it's the first time you're thinking about these concepts in terms of area-based violence prevention. What are your thoughts? Where do you see the opportunities, and how would you like us to support you going forward?
Okay, I hope everybody is back in the same room after we were in 3 breakaway rooms at different universes. Welcome back. I would like to bring it together a little bit. The first session, I'm really thankful that so many took the time to spend about 2.5 hours with us, exploring a little bit concepts of violence prevention, and in particular also under a gender lens. It was great to see the interaction between the various people. We would like to encourage and invite you for the next session, which will happen next week. The invite is out already. All of you are invited. Will be an online session where we go deeper and give a couple of practical examples. I mentioned it earlier, looking in particular in early childhood development, which is a very nice example of the socio-ecological model. And then also exploring a little bit the structural violence around the question around security of tenure, because you can imagine if you live in an informal settlement and you don't have security of tenure, you are in a quite vulnerable situation and volatile situation. So how can we give a little bit more permanence to people, and what are tools to do that? So I hope there's a little bit of an appetizer for next week. But a big thank you to the whole team, to the technical team in the background, to Tanya, to Fiona, to Catherine, and Kim and Iris that are with me here in the room. Thomas, I would like to close that here and just invite the people. Is there any last word from your side?
No, just a big thank you for an excellent session, VPOU and Tanya in particular from our side, which was not only an appetizer. I think there were lots of really good insights, and I also think it was great to have some input now also from some of the colleagues in those 20 minutes. So thanks very much. I'm really looking forward for the next weeks. And maybe just one reminder, we have our colleagues from the Isandla Institute also here on the Community of Practice event on the 11th of May. Should you have not received an invite, please let us know. But we are hoping, of course, for a very broad participation in Cape Town on the 11th of May on a lot of these sharings and insights and knowledge that we're discussing here. We'll also pick up in the Community of Practice event on the 11th. So please register for the event and please join us on the 11th of May. Inga will also share again the email. She's done it, and maybe we'll put it also here again in the chat. Thanks very much. And again, VPOU and Tanya for this excellent session. And thanks again as well for all the advisory group members. It was marvelous. And Monica, but I also saw Ugeshni, who was here, Nosy was here, and some other colleagues that I may have missed for all your contribution. Thanks a lot. Oh, sorry. Katrin, please, over to you.
I just wanted to thank you again, colleagues, for joining us today. And I wanted to remind you of our next sessions coming up on the 20th and the 26th of April. And we will be discussing again violence prevention through urban upgrading methodologies on the 20th and the role of local government on the 26th. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope that we have a fruitful interaction again next time. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.